Hello, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, the podcast series where I get to dive much deeper into a speaker's ideas than is possible during their short TED Talk. Today, we're exploring one of my favorite topics, consciousness. To me, it's the biggest, most compelling mystery we have. How on earth is it that soggy grey matter inside your head manages to feel things and create that feeling you have right now that you are a person listening to a podcast? Most scientists would agree that they really don't yet have a compelling explanation of consciousness. Today's guest, Anil Seth, is working on this problem, and I love the way he framed it in his recent TED Talk.
Somehow, within each of our brains, the combined activity of many billions of neurons, each one a tiny biological machine, is generating a conscious experience. And not just any conscious experience, your conscious experience right here and right now. How does this happen? Well, answering this question is so important because consciousness for each of us is all there is. Without it, there's no world, there's no self, there's nothing at all.
Now, we recorded this conversation live at the TED Summit in Edinburgh this past summer. Our goal was to make the topic as accessible as possible to a broad audience. The live audience certainly seemed to love what they heard, and I hope you will too. Are you ready? All right, hello. Welcome. We are in for a treat. Welcome to this special live recording of the TED Interview podcast. So this is the podcast that begins really where a TED Talk ends. And today, that's going to be especially important because we're diving into ideas that are as deep as they get. Who are we? Why do we have these feelings? Our guest is one of the most interesting people I've ever spoke to on this topic of consciousness. He runs a research lab at the University of Sussex devoted to it. 2 years ago, he gave a fantastic TED Talk on the topic, which was seen more than 8 million times. A lot of people out there clearly interested in it. And next year, he's coming out with a major book on the topic called Being You, The Real Science of Consciousness. So a warm welcome, if you will, for Anil Seth.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, Anil. So look, this is such. There are so many questions on this topic. It's easy to get lost. I thought an interesting way to structure it would be to ask all of the big questions that we're used to, i.e., the what, when, how, who, where, and why of consciousness. We're going to get through as many of those as we can. No problem, right?
I can't see any problems with that strategy.
All right, well, let's start. What is consciousness?
Consciousness is, in one sense, it's the most familiar thing for any of us. I mean, consciousness, we all know what it's like to be conscious. We have conscious experiences all day. It's any kind of experience whatsoever. Those of you who've had general anesthesia will know what it's like when consciousness goes away. There are periods without consciousness. But it is the most familiar thing for any of us. At the same time, it's also the most mysterious thing because we really still don't understand how mechanisms, how physical, biological things can give rise to the redness of red or the taste of some food, the taste of some salmon.
And the words we use sometimes confuse us because the word consciousness is used in lots of different ways to talk about raising consciousness and so forth. You're referring to something much more specific than that.
That's right. I think the most basic definition of consciousness is that for a conscious system, and especially for a conscious organism, let's talk about animals for the moment, there is something it is like to be that organism. There is the presence of some kind of experience. Now, this doesn't have to be some sort of high-level cognitive thinking. It doesn't have to involve language. It doesn't even have to involve a sense of being a particular person or an individual. Just the presence of any kind of raw feeling, that is sufficient for consciousness.
All right. So if you've ever seen a color or tasted coffee or felt a pain, even without asking any existential questions, you are conscious, you are sentient. It's almost the same.
I use the two words synonymously. Yeah, consciousness, awareness, sentience, the presence of any kind of experience whatsoever.
Okay. Where is consciousness? Like, is it just inside our head?
That's a good starting hypothesis. It's remarkable, but this fact, back in the Greeks, Aristotle was right about many things, but he thought the brain had little to do with consciousness, famously. But for most of history of medicine, especially since the Renaissance, it's been pretty clear that consciousness depends on the brain, and general anesthesia works on the brain, and so on.
If you said that your brain is where consciousness is, it's connected to your spinal column, to all these nerve endings, they're in one sense, in all of you, is kind of part of that conscious thing. Isn't there actually a mystery about where consciousness is?
I'm not sure that it's that mysterious. So I'm holding my hand in front of me, and I clearly perceive it as my hand. I experience it as my hand. But that's it doesn't mean the consciousness is there in my hand. It's again a form of perception. There's sensory data coming from vision, coming from pain sensors, coming from what we call proprioceptive sensors. The best guess my brain makes about the causes of all this is that something damaged my hand, and so that's the best perception to have, is that my hand is suffering somehow. But we can be mistaken about it too, and that's where it gets really cool, that just things that we think we could never be mistaken about, such as, like, this is my arm. Now, I'm holding my arm up. How could I ever be mistaken that this is my arm? But there's a condition called somatoparaphrenia, where people have a specific experience that their limbs are not their own limbs. That they will say, no, doctor, that's not my arm, it's yours, or my sister's. And even when you point it out that it's attached to their shoulder, that's not sufficiently convincing. But this is, and it just shows that things that we take for granted about the relationship between our appearance and reality can be brought into question. And of course, the consciousness is in the brain in the sense that the mechanisms that give rise to our experience, I think, are inside the skull.
Okay. When is consciousness?
So this is a very interesting question, actually, because at some point, for each person listening to this, for everybody in this room now, there will have been a time that consciousness emerged. Before you were born, there was no consciousness. That was yours, that you identified with. The system that's your brain and your body just didn't exist for a certain period.
But a bit before you were born, we don't know, right? So a baby, we think, doesn't have a sense of self, but certainly is conscious in the sense of feeling things. A baby can feel pain.
It's an open question. Yes, I think so too. But for a long time, actually, in medicine, anesthetics were not routinely given to very young children or babies on the assumption they didn't really feel pain, which is really a very bizarre. But certainly things like a sense of self and an ability to reflect, ability to recognize in the mirror. So most human infants don't recognize a mirror image as themselves until, let's say, the age of 18 months, something like that. But yes, certainly before then, you assume, and there's good evidence, that there is some kind of experience going on. But the question is actually very hard to get firm scientific evidence for, in much the same way that it's much the same reason that it's difficult to get a firm evidence for whether non-human animals are conscious, because the methodology we typically rely on is to ask somebody, did you feel that? Did you see that? And unless the system you're asking, whether it's a human infant or an octopus or a computer, can give you reasonable responses to that, then it's very difficult to know what the fact of the matter is.
And even if they can give you reasonable responses, you still don't really know. Like if the computer says, are you conscious? Sure. We still don't know.
That's right. So
it's almost more about knowing, the more we know about the processes that lead to consciousness in humans, the more clues that will give us about where else it might be.
That's exactly right. So if we can figure out the mechanisms that give rise to and shape conscious experience in human adults or non-infants, then we can use that as a sort of benchmark to make inferences about where and when we are likely to find consciousness in the rest of the world.
So on the one question, you definitely don't have consciousness when you're under anesthetic. When you're asleep, you presumably do have a form of consciousness if you're dreaming, for example.
Certainly when you're dreaming. But for me, I remember a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, I had a couple of operations which required general anesthesia. And it was one of the more remarkable experiences or non-experiences that I've ever had or not had. And it's completely different from falling asleep. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but this particular time, it really struck me that when I came round from general anesthesia, it could have been 5 minutes, it could have been 500 years. There was just nothing in between. I was there, and then I was back. But falling asleep, you always have some idea of how much time has passed. And there are periods when you might be completely without consciousness, but actually there's been a lot of experiments lately where people have woken up sleeping people at various stages and just asked them, were you conscious of something? And quite often, even outside of this REM, rapid eye movement stage of sleep associated with dreaming, people report some form of inner life going on.
So even if it's just somehow tricking, registering your sense of time, there may well be something going on when you're asleep. This one question is interesting because we tend to think about consciousness, certainly of when you think of it associated with the self, as sort of, you're there or you're not. But this one question pushes you to a different model already, because you already talked about a baby sort of, and before a baby is born and, becoming a toddler, there's a sort of coming into focus at the very least, right? And then at the other end of life, maybe a slow going out of focus. I mean, how should we think about that?
I think it fades away in different respects as well. So one thing I think that we're all susceptible to is we overestimate the subjective continuity of ourselves as individuals. So, I think I'm Anil Seth. I sort of think I'm the same person that I was yesterday, that I was 2 years ago, and that I will be in 2 years or 10 years hence. But there's always this interesting question, are you really the same person that you were when you were a kid, or that you were even 5 years ago? We all know from other forms of experiments about perception that if things change slowly, we tend not to perceive them as changing at all. And I actually think this applies to our experience of being who we are much more, that we experience ourselves as not changing. And there are good reasons for that, because experiencing yourself as a stable individual over time probably allows you to behave more adaptively, more effectively in the world. But our experience that we're having of being me probably is changing all the time, albeit quite slowly. And then at the end, of course, the end of life, where we have maybe the disintegration of a sense of identity through dementia or through Alzheimer's, it's not that consciousness is lost entirely. People in this state are extremely aware of certain things, of perceptual experiences, but their experience of being a continuous individual, that's the specific thing that is changing faster at these times.
So we're already seeing, I think, implications of what you believe about consciousness on other really important topics. Depending on what you believe about what a baby experiences before they're born, that could impact your view on the abortion question, I guess. And depending on what you believe about the end of life, it could impact how you feel about questions like euthanasia and so forth. It feels highly significant to have a more nuanced sense of who are we.
I think there is a lot at stake here. It's kind of easy sometimes to dismiss consciousness research as some quite abstract philosophical question that people have been worrying about for 100 years and maybe coming up with very extraordinary ideas that maybe we need a complete revolution in physics, something like this, to understand how consciousness is part of the universe. But there are many more immediate reasons to engage in the scientific study of consciousness. Even if we don't solve the ultimate problem of how consciousness is part of the universe at all, we already know that the experiences that people have are shaped in very clear ways by what's going on in their brains and their bodies. And if we understand these factors, these mechanisms, these influences that give us the experience of the world around us and of who we are within it, there's so much at stake for all the questions that you mentioned, for how we treat people at the beginning of life, at the end of life, for how we deal with the epidemic of mental illness and psychiatric disorder, which is really manifest in alterations of conscious experience. That's what drives people to go see a psychiatrist.
And maybe even beyond that, I mean, the only thing that matters at one level is what people experience. Like, the only reason we care about any issue is because it somehow impacts at some point on suffering or joy, or, like if no one felt anything, nothing would really frankly matter a damn anyway. So in a way, it's the underpinning of everything that matters, right?
Yeah, there's a lovely thought experiment. Generally a bit skeptical of thought experiments because they don't generate any data. But this one is kind of fun because it really underlines what is at stake. And let's say that my lab is actually much more successful than it actually is, and we've developed this amazing new technology, and I'm going to offer you the deal of a lifetime. I have this medical procedure, and if you undergo it, you will never die, you will never get ill, you will be in perfect health, you will be able to think clearly, achieve all the things that you want to do. But I cannot guarantee that you will still experience any of this. Unfortunately, I just don't know whether there'll be any experience at all. But you can do this, and you might be, and I think you probably will be, but there's no cast iron guarantee. So the question is, will you take this deal of a lifetime?
I'd be tempted. I mean, if you could literally live forever and it was like a 50-50 shot, I'd go, okay, 50% times infinity equals quite a lot. But
that's how the math works, right?
I'd take it. But it would be a tragedy if I took it and nothing was felt, because that is the whole point.
To put it to its maximum extent, consciousness is the only thing that matters. For each of us individually, for any system, all our morals, all our ethics, all our joy, all our pain, all our suffering only has the meaning that it has because it impacts and is manifest through conscious experiences that exist for somebody or for something.
Okay, so now let's come to the core of what you actually do. How is consciousness? How does it arise?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, so there's two approaches you can take to addressing this question. One is that you try and tackle it head on. You say, okay, there are certain things in the world. There are brains, which are made of neurons. Neurons are made of various chemicals and molecules. How is it that any kind of mechanism can give rise to any kind of experience at all? The philosopher David Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness. So somehow it's widely accepted that experience arises from a physical basis. It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. This is an extremely difficult problem for which people are still just casting flares into the dark for a solution. I'm very interested in this problem, but day to day I focus on a slightly different problem, which is that we are conscious. We have conscious experiences. They depend in systematic ways on what happens in brains and in bodies. And if we can map out those relationships in ways that are more than just drawing correlations and saying, oh yeah, pain, this bit of the brain lights up, love, this bit of the brain lights up, but really try to explain why our experience of the self is the way it is, why our experience of vision is the way that it is, then we can make the right kind of progress. And the analogy I use, and I know it's an imperfect analogy, but it's still useful, is life. It wasn't that long ago, 100 years ago, people thought, most scientists, most biologists thought that life was not something that you could explain in terms of mechanisms. And biologists no longer think this at all, right? I mean, we still don't understand everything about life, but this sense of mystery has faded away as biologists just gone on with the job of setting out the properties of living systems and trying to account for those properties almost individually, just break the problem down. And I do think we can take the same approach to consciousness. Now, there might still be a residue of mystery at the end, but until we've done those hard miles of trying to account for the sorts of experiences that we have, that infants have, that other animals might have, then it's an open question whether there'll still be a mystery at the end of it.
I mean, I think it's an interesting analogy, but it was funny, there's another analogy that I also love that possibly, I mean, tell me if this is similar, like magnets. I would sit there as a boy, look at these magnets, and you would feel this force on them. Mm-hmm. And it was like, what? How is that? That just makes no sense. How can that happen? And then someone tells you, well, it's connected to electricity. Like if you move electrons around in a certain pattern, it's going to create that force. And you go, well, don't be silly. How could moving anything around in a circle create a force between it? And yet I get that with once you spent some time in physics and you look at Maxwell's equations and, the mystery of magnetism slowly ebbs. And you're kind of saying the same thing here, that as we understand more about the mechanism, see that it's not just a conversation about correlation, but a conversation that somehow goes deeper than that the mystery will ebb away.
That's the job of science. Once you can explain, predict, and control, you've done what we ask of pretty much any other scientific explanation. But people sometimes don't feel satisfied with that when it comes to consciousness, because we are conscious. I think there's this idea we should have this aha moment, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Now I understand.
What I'm curious to hear is some of the actual how then. Let's see if some of the mystery here starts to ebb away. Talk about some of the how that you've been working on and some of the insights that you presented in your talk and so forth.
So the main approach that I'm taking and my colleagues in the lab at Sussex and many other labs too is this idea that the brain at a very deep level is a prediction machine. And the purpose of perception in all its variety, whether it's perception of the world or perception of the self, is not to figure out accurately what's out there, but to help the organism stay alive. If you think about our brains, they're locked inside the skull, it's dark in there, it's silent. So everything that we consciously perceive has to be a kind of inference, a brain-based best guess about the causes of sensory signals. These sensory signals don't even come with labels on them that I'm from the eyes and are therefore to do with vision, and I'm from the ears and therefore to do with sound. It's all just electrical signals. This changes very dramatically how we think about perception, because it seems sensible to think about consciousness and conscious perception, that there's sensory information that's coming from the world and it's sort of read out inside the brain, maybe by the self. And maybe it's shaped in various ways by expectations that we have of what context we're in or where we are. But it's still fundamentally this outside-in direction. The prediction machine view suggests that it's the other way around entirely, that what we perceive is coming from the inside out, that it's this brain's best guess. And the sensory information is just this process of error correction, that it's reining in our brain's predictions to keep them yoked to the world, to their causes in the world in some appropriate way.
So in some sense, right now we've constructed this 3D model of this theater with people sitting there. We assume that that is what it's going to be, and unless someone walks in or out of the door and sort of surprises us, our brain isn't really paying attention to it. It's just, this is the world that we navigate. That is our model. The actual thing that is out there might in fact be very different. This might just be some form of computer code or who knows what out there that we have somehow, because of how we are built and how we grow up, we've somehow modeled this thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's this, for me, the main reference to this is in philosophy would be Kant, that there is something out there, it's unknowable, it's this noumenon. All we can experience is our own brain's model of this ultimately unknowable reality. And the question is, how deep does that go? It's one thing to say, so the example I love for this is a very simple one, is colour. So colours, and we've known this since Newton, colours don't objectively exist out there in the world at all. The brain creates them from combinations of wavelengths, and they're a useful trick that evolutionists hit on to keep track of surfaces when lighting conditions change. What we consciously see in one sense is a subset of what's out there, because our eyes are only sensitive to a small section of the electromagnetic spectrum. But in another sense, what we see is more than what's out there, because any colour is a construction of the brain. It's not that we see a subset of colours. Colours are a creation of the brain to help it better navigate a complex world. And I think that runs through everything. What we consciously see is both less than and more than its causes out there in the world.
You had, in your talk, you presented a powerful example of this in audio, and I invited you to bring a different version on here, so I haven't heard this yet. Can we try this out?
Let's give it a go.
Okay, so you're about to hear something. What was that? Objectively, what was that? Bunch of sounds. Listen again. Doesn't really make much sense. Now, Anil, I invite you to hack the brains of everyone in this room for a minute.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Now listen again. So that's incredible, right? So that is an example of your brain modeling a set of words and meaning when the data was never actually objectively there. It needed training, it needed guidance. It's miraculous.
I think it's a lovely example. It's called sine wave speech, this technique, and you can generate all kinds of fun examples of this. And it is remarkable because the sensory signal is exactly the same. So your ears are getting exactly the same sensory information, but the experience is very different. And the way to understand that, I think, is that when I say the actual phrase, I'm giving each of you a higher level expectation about the causes of this weird undulating sound that you heard the first time. And we're familiar with this in a number of other contexts too. If anyone who's learned a foreign language, it can first sound just like random streams of noise, not even segmented into words. But as we come to learn the language, we start to hear separate words rather than just this continuous stream of sounds. And this, I think, runs through everything that we perceive, and it shows that it doesn't just shape perception so that it's this sound rather than that sound. It actually constitutes the perceptual experience that we have. So
you're sort of priming the prediction machine to say, okay, this is about to happen. And so we're doing that all the time.
We're doing that all the time in all the perceptual modalities that we have. We're doing in vision, and it's not that we sort of predict what's happening in 1 second in the future and check whether it matches. This is happening continuously, and this process of prediction, taking in sensory information, check the predictions, update the predictions. That's what I think is this cycle of activity that underlies every experience, an experience of seeing something, of hearing something, of feeling an emotion, where now the prediction is about what's happening inside the body.
So this is what leads you to say that reality is a kind of hallucination. Talk about that.
Yeah. So this can be misunderstood. It can be misunderstood as saying that nothing exists or nothing is real, and I don't mean it like that at all. In fact, after the TED Talk a couple of years, I did and still do get a stream of emails inviting me to go and stand in front of a bus if I really think that everything is a hallucination. And just for the record, I'm not advising anybody to do that. I certainly haven't done it myself. Things exist. It's the way they appear in our perceptual experience that is a construction of the brain. And the reason to use the word hallucination, I don't use it lightly, is because it marks a continuity between normal perception and what we typically think of hallucination. So when we use the word hallucination kind of colloquially, usually means false perception. Somebody is seeing something that is not there or that other people are not seeing, hearing voices, having a visual image of somebody. What I think is going on is that that's the same process. It's just that when people are actually hallucinating, their perceptual predictions are not being appropriately reined in by sensory data. But it's still the same process. So what we call normal perception is another kind of hallucination, but it's a controlled one, where our brain's predictions are all the time being guided by our interactions with the world.
Okay, so let me push back a bit on this, wearing my devil's advocate hat. Yes, our brain may be doing very clever things, but why is it that everyone else out there seems to have the same hallucination? Like in detail. So lots of people there all responded to that experiment you showed in the same way. There's an incredibly rich, structured, external something out there that we all agree on. And the fact that we all see those letters there as red, there is an objective reality out there that is reflecting the same narrow spectrum of electromagnetic light into all of our eyes, so that we all have that same experience. Aren't you overstating the hallucination thing?
No. But let me push back against your pushback, because the red TED sign behind us, over my right shoulder now, maybe we're overestimating the degree to which we are all experiencing the same thing. And there are people with synesthesia who, when they look at letters in black, will experience colors, sometimes co-located spatially with a letter, sometimes somewhere else. And I think we're sort of culturally guided to report having the same experiences, even though we might be having quite different experiences. Of course, they're not going to be totally different experiences. Evolution has ensured that brains in general are wired up to track whatever is out there in ways that are helpful for our survival. So it's no surprise that we have experiences that at least we tell each other are similar. But again, it's not always the case. Do you remember the dress? The dress that went around the internet that was either black and blue or it was white and gold, and people had furious arguments about what that same image was. Yeah, the dress that broke the internet. To me, that's interesting in many ways. It's fascinating because people argued so much about it, right? People were really determined that it was not possible that if they saw it one way, that anybody else could see it the other way. But people did see it the other way, and about half and half. So if it's possible for half the population to interpret even a simple photo as so radically different from the other half, could it not be that our perceptual worlds are in fact more different than we typically assume, just when we use sort of linguistic labels to pick out and describe these experiences?
So maybe that dress exposed the kind of the glitch in the matrix. What's the range of possibilities for what might actually be out there? I mean, it could be like approximately like we think it is.
I mean, already our sort of best guess about what physical reality like is absolutely nothing to do with how we perceive it. Right? I mean, our current best guess of the nature of physical reality delivered to us by extraordinary accomplishments in physics is some kind of quantum soup of stuff, maybe strings of some sort in 12 dimensions. I don't know, maybe it's 13. But whatever it is, even if it's quantum physics of particles and waves that both exist and don't exist, that makes no sense in terms of our phenomenal experience of the world as it is. Our experience of the world as it is roughly Newtonian objects that move. And I think this is the job of science. The job of science is always to dig underneath appearance and try and get closer to reality. And we've already discovered these massive gaps between our experience and reality through other scientific disciplines.
I mean, are there other possibilities completely besides the sort of the standard physics story of, it could just be the matrix, it could be code? Like, what are the other possibilities in your mind? We could all be living in a simulation.
Yeah, so this is the simulation hypothesis has been very provocative, I think, in philosophy of mind. And it is this idea that can we really rule out that we are in a sort of a weird computer simulation, maybe designed by some post-human super-intelligent teenage hacker who's got nothing better to do than to rerun ancestor simulations until tea time, and we're just living in one of those. But these ways of thinking make an assumption that consciousness is some form of information processing, that it's something that can be simulated. And this seems a kind of a natural assumption for many people. They just assume that, experiences some form of computation, some form of functional relations in the brain. It's just a matter of getting the input-output relations right. It doesn't matter what the thing is made of, whether it's wetware from neurons or hardware from silicon, that it's just a matter of processing of information. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not saying that's definitely wrong, but I don't see why it's such a safe assumption. I think we overestimate the similarity of the brain to a computer. It's not just electrical impulses going from neuron to neuron. There are chemicals washing around. It's as much a chemical machine as it is a network of electrical connections. So it could be something else. There's this tendency I think we all have when we see something complicated happen to intuit that there's a mind at work. That doesn't mean that it's a conscious mind. It doesn't mean that it's anything like a human mind, but we tend to interpret things through the lens of how we understand ourselves. I mean, this is anthropocentrism, which has been kind of a slightly annoying aspect of our intellectual history for centuries.
Let's ask a couple of these other questions. So, given all this, who is conscious? Who can be conscious?
So, who is... It points at a very interesting distinction. So on the one hand, who refers to sense of self. It's like, who are you, Chris? Who am I, Anil? So I think going back to where we started, it's possible to be conscious without being self-conscious.
Right.
This might apply to infants. It might apply to people with dementia. Self-consciousness is optional. You can suffer without being a person over time that remembers that suffering. There's the more fundamental question of what other organisms and maybe what other systems can have conscious experiences at all. For what kind of thing is there something it is like to be that thing?
And where would you guess? So apes, I'm guessing yes.
Definitely apes.
Octopuses?
Straight from apes to octopuses.
No? different
You've got an interesting evolutionary tree.
Different branch of life, but...
Actually, octopus is a very good example. So just to sort of put them, without going through the whole menagerie of all kinds of life, if you just lump all mammals together, I mean, basically all mammals share the same neuronal hardware that we're pretty sure is implicated in consciousness for humans. In fact, a lot of what we know about consciousness in humans, we know from experiments with monkeys and cats and so on. So there's a sort of assumption there. And if you've ever seen an orangutan look at a magic trick, there's no doubt that it's very hard to resist the interpretation that they're responding to something. But there's a danger too in attributing consciousness based on superficial similarity to humans. And the octopus is a lovely example because octopuses are about as far removed on the evolutionary tree as you can get while remaining in the animal kingdom and with animals that show sophisticated behavior. The last common ancestor between humans and octopuses is probably about 600 million years ago. It's probably some kind of flatworm of some sort. And this is phenomenal because octopuses are smart. They can do so many things. And it's almost as if evolution has invented minds twice over.
So it's interesting. So you're saying, I mean, you said that octopuses are smart, but just because they're smart doesn't mean that they are conscious.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting distinction, and I guess that applies to computers as well, potentially, right? That's not a distinction that people have made much, at least that I haven't heard until the last 10 or 20 years, that there could be a difference between intelligence and actually being conscious. This strikes me as huge.
Yeah, I think I've wrestled with this a lot, and it's all tied up together, this idea that consciousness is a form of information processing and intelligence is also a form of information processing. I think it's probably the implicit acceptance of that it's one reason people link intelligence and consciousness together. Another reason, I think, again, is the fact of human exceptionalism. I mean, we really think we're special, don't we, humans? I mean, we thought we were at the center of the universe. We're not. We thought we were different from all other animals. We're not. And now we think we've got this intelligence and this consciousness which sets us apart. And guess what? It doesn't either. I think consciousness and intelligence are probably what we would say doubly dissociable. You can have one without the other. And you just think about probably the most basic conscious experience, and certainly the one that matters most ethically, of suffering. I don't think you have to be intelligent, or an organism doesn't have to be smart to suffer. If you are intelligent, it gives you more ways of suffering. You can have regrets, but it's not necessary. And it's also not sufficient, and I think that's what we're getting to with AI these days, that we are starting to see the emergence of systems that we will attribute some degree of intelligence to. And the tendency is to, at the same time, or to that extent, also attribute some sort of consciousness as well. And so I think if we do this, we risk two dangers. We're going to over-attribute consciousness to things that are not, just because they seem smart, and we're going to under-attribute it to things that are conscious, but that don't seem so because they don't seem sufficiently human-like, sufficiently cognitively competent.
So this strikes me as one reason why this topic is going to only grow in importance in the next couple of decades. Assume that at some level, the AIs that are being built just continue on the trajectory on. They continue to get ever more amazing, to blow us away. They start to, for example, engage us in credible, believable language. You could have a real convincing conversation with an AI where it says, "Oh, you don't know? Let me find an answer to that for you. I've read 400 books, and here's my best summary of the things. I really think you should think about this." We're going to be blown away by them, but so much hangs on whether we believe that there is consciousness at work as opposed to just functionality, functional intelligence.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to hone our intuitions about this quite substantially over the coming years. It's already becoming a problem. And the circle of concern, for a long time, people didn't attribute consciousness to other animals. But actually, in medieval times, people did. And there was a whole history of the criminal prosecution of animals, which I find just really weird and bizarre, where pigs would get accused of murder and given a trial, and rats were accused of infesting a house, but were actually let off. Their lawyer argued that they couldn't be expected to turn up to court because they had a reasonable fear of being eaten on the way. And this, getting back to machines, yeah, we are going to be faced with systems that are designed to give us the impression that they have conscious experiences. And here's a question for where we should go with artificial intelligence research. Should we really be trying to design systems that give us that appearance? There's this sort of implicit idea that the moonshot goal of AI is to develop a system that is indistinguishable from a human being. I think this could be very dangerous, that technology best serves us when it complements us, not when it tries to reinstantiate or replace us. But how we respond is still a work in progress. I mean, I was struck by one of my favorite films that explores this issue as Ex Machina by the director Alex Garland. In the scene in Ex Machina, there's this idea where this crazy inventor shows an artificial robotic person to the other character and says, no, the real test is to show you that she's a machine and see if you still feel she has consciousness. What is it that leads us to perceive or interpret a system as intelligent or as conscious? That's an answerable question, and we need to get answers to that question to know how these technologies that give the impression of being conscious are going to affect us.
Can we get an answer to that question as to the difference between those two, as to whether there actually is consciousness there, only by going deeper into the how of what is actually giving rise to conscious experience?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the right thing to do, is to make these judgments. If we just make them on the basis of superficial similarity to humans or gut instinct, we're going to be misled. We need to know more about what the biological and physical basis of consciousness is in those organisms, especially humans, which we're sure of have conscious experiences. That will allow us to tune our inferences more broadly.
Okay, so here's the last one of these questions. Why? Why is anything conscious?
This is the function of consciousness. So there's I think it was the biologist Theodore Dobzhansky said famously that nothing in biology ever makes sense except in the light of evolution. And if we think that consciousness is not a spooky thing, it's a biological phenomenon. At one point in the history of life on Earth, there was no consciousness at all. We were just a hot rock. At some point, the lights were on, and the glimmering has been growing. What's it for? It's not for having complex thoughts or writing poetry or doing philosophy or even doing science. There's something more basic going on about why evolution has taken advantage of the ability for awareness to exist in the universe. I mean, what it seems to do for us is it provides a vast amount of information about things happening in the body and in the world in a single unified format that then allows us to guide action very flexibly. When we're aware of something, I can be simultaneously aware of my visual surroundings, of sound, of voices, of the internal state of my body through emotion and mood. And when I'm conscious of something out there, then I can decide whether to run away from it, run towards it, eat it, mate with it. Many different things that I can do. If I'm not conscious, even if my mind be still sensitive to its presence, then I generally can't behave flexibly. So I think consciousness gives us this very generic ability to behave adaptively and flexibly.
But I don't find that answer yet just very satisfying, because there's all kinds of complex behavior in biological systems that we think probably aren't conscious. They can still respond and eat and mate and do these different things kind of through just through the chemistry, the biochemistry that is in them. It's not obvious to me why something that seemed as radical as feeling things was functionally needed.
There is no knockdown single argument for why evolutionists hit upon consciousness as a useful thing to endow organisms with. But if we do look at what it does for creatures who are conscious, it does present and integrate lots of sensory signals, lots of perceptual modalities together in a way that we can guide flexible behavior with. So I would just say it's a working hypothesis.
Anil, just give one example of how, you think about this all the time. How has it impacted your actual life?
There's no other version of me it's true. I mean, I've been thinking about it forever. In one sense, I really feel like an extremely fortunate person because, I started thinking about consciousness at school. Many people do, who am I? What's going on? And forever, I just expected somebody to tell me to stop doing that and do something grown up now and more sensible with my life. And I'm still expecting that to happen, but it hasn't yet. And it's turned out to be a viable career, which is interesting. But it has, I think, affected my life. Pretty much every day, and probably many times each day, I will sort of reflect on, I'll be walking around and I will just think, what is the relationship between what I'm seeing now and what's actually going on? I think it's a bit like what I might have got had I been disciplined enough to meditate for the last 30 years, that you have this now ability to separate the immediacy of experience from your thinking about what's actually happening. And you can also recognize, I now think of myself as not an immutable, unchanging essence, but also a perception. So when emotions come, when aversive and bad emotions come, then you can more easily think of them as just perceptions that will pass and that are there for the purpose of guiding behavior, but don't necessarily reflect reality as it is. And I think that's the main difference. It's also made me much more comfortable with the idea of not existing. And of course, this is again a question that I think everybody wrestles with at some point. What happens when we die? What happens? And we weren't conscious before we were born. So it
wasn't a problem then.
It wasn't a problem then. It seems pretty clear that when we're gone, it also won't be a problem for us. But that's easy to say now. I think ask me again when I'm up close and personal with oblivion, I might have a different answer.
I know one last little seed to plant in people's minds here as they think about consciousness.
The last seed I'll plant in people's minds is that the self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is itself a perception.
Anil Seth, thank you so much. neuroscientist and author Anil Seth, recorded live at the TED Summit in Edinburgh. Check out his TED Talk. It's provocatively titled, "Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality." You can find it at TED.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think of the show by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. This week's show was produced by Lacey Roberts at Transmitter Media. Our production manager is Roxanne Hylash. Our show is mixed by David Herman. Our theme music is by Alison Leighton Brown. Special thanks to my colleague, Michelle Quint. I'm Chris Anderson. Thanks for listening. In our next episode, I get to speak with the celebrated novelist Elif Shafak. Elif urges us all to become more engaged citizens.
Overall, what I believe in sincerely is, I think faith is way too important to leave to the religious. And patriotism is way too important to leave it to the nationalists. Just like the tech world is way too important to leave to tech monopolies, and politics is way too important to leave to politicians. In all these fields, we can become more engaged citizens.